I was hired to protect a multi-million-dollar estate from the outside world, but I quickly realized the massive stone walls weren't built for privacy, they were built for containment. I have worked in high-end security for over a decade. I've seen the way the ultra-wealthy live, hidden behind gates and high-tech surveillance, but I had never seen anything like the Blackwood Estate. It was a sprawling property tucked away in a valley that the sun seemed to avoid, surrounded by a 10-foot-tall stone wall topped with wrought iron spikes. My job was simple: sit in the high-tech gatehouse, monitor the perimeter cameras, and ensure that no one entered. I was told the owners were eccentric and valued their solitude above all else. They paid triple the industry standard, and in my line of work, you don't ask questions when the money is that good. The estate itself was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, but it felt cold, not just in temperature but in spirit. Even on the warmest days, a thin gray mist seemed to cling to the manicured lawns like a wet shroud. My first few shifts were boringly normal. I spent 12 hours a night staring at 16 different camera feeds showing nothing but wind-blown trees and empty gravel paths. But during the second week, the boring shift became a lesson in pure, unadulterated dread. It was roughly 1:15 a.m. when I noticed a glitch on camera 7 which covered the North Woods perimeter. The screen flickered with static, and for a split second I saw a figure standing directly against the stone wall. It wasn't a person in a hoodie or a trespasser. It was a silhouette so dark it looked like a hole cut out of the night. It was at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that seemed just a little too long to be human. By the time I adjusted the focus, the screen was clear. Nothing but trees. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation and the grainy quality of the night vision. But an hour later I heard it, a soft rhythmic sound against the reinforced glass of the gatehouse. Tink, tink, tink. It sounded like someone was tapping a ring against the glass. I turned slowly, my hand moving toward my holster. The gatehouse was illuminated by the glow of the monitors, casting long shadows behind me. Standing just inches from the glass was a hand. Or at least, I think it was a hand. It was pale, the color of a fish's belly, with fingers that ended in sharp, jagged points that looked more like bone than fingernails. It tapped again, a slow, deliberate cadence that felt like it was counting my heartbeats. I lunged for the spotlight controls, flooding the exterior with 10,000 lumens of blinding white light. The space outside the glass was empty. No footprints in the soft mud, no disturbed bushes, nothing. I checked the recordings. The cameras showed me standing up and turning toward the window, but the space outside the glass remained perfectly, hauntingly vacant on the digital record. My eyes saw a monster, the cameras saw nothing. The rest of the night was spent in a state of vibrating anxiety. I kept the exterior lights on, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I felt a weight in the air, a pressure on my chest that made every breath a struggle. Just before dawn, I saw the most unsettling thing of all. I looked at the main house through the long-range thermal camera. The house was supposed to be empty for the weekend, but the thermal signature showed a massive heat bloom in the grand ballroom. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was a swirling, chaotic mass of heat that moved with a frantic, pulsing energy. And as I watched, the heat bloom split into 3 distinct shapes, each one moving toward the windows. They stood there, glowing bright red on my monitor, staring directly toward my gatehouse. I realized then that I wasn't there to keep people out. I was a canary in a coal mine, and the air was getting very, very thin. I had 12 hours until my next shift, and for the first time in my career, I considered running and never looking back. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and I needed to know what those walls were really hiding. I didn't sleep during my 12 hours off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale, spindly hand tapping against the reinforced glass of the gatehouse. I saw the heat signatures in the empty ballroom splitting and moving with that jerky, unnatural speed. I spent my afternoon doing research, digging through old property records and local newspaper archives, trying to find anything on the Blackwood family. What I found made the hair on my neck stand up. The estate had changed hands 6 times in the last 20 years. Each sale was a quick flip at a massive loss, and 2 of the previous owners had simply vanished, their cars still in the driveway, their dinner still on the table. When I pulled up to the gate for my next shift, the massive stone walls felt like they were leaning in toward me. My replacement, a grizzled veteran named Miller, looked pale. He didn't even wait for the formal handoff. He just handed me the keys, muttered, "Stay in the booth and keep the lights on," and practically ran to his truck. He didn't look back as he sped down the gravel road. I locked myself in the gatehouse, checked the perimeter alarms, and settled in. For the first few hours it was quiet, too quiet. Even the crickets and the night birds seemed to have abandoned the valley. Then around midnight the ballroom music started. It wasn't loud, it was a faint, tinny sound like an old gramophone playing a distorted waltz. It drifted across the lawn, weaving through the mist until it filled the gatehouse. I checked the audio sensors on the main house. The meters were peaking. I turned the long-range thermal camera toward the house again. The ballroom was glowing white-hot. But this time the heat wasn't just in the room. I watched in horror as a thermal bloom, bright red and orange, seemed to seep through the solid stone wall of the mansion. It didn't use a door or a window. It moved through the masonry like water through a sponge. It was out on the lawn now, and it was moving directly toward me. I gripped the edge of the desk, my eyes glued to the monitor. On the thermal feed, the shape was a jagged, pulsing mass about 8 feet tall. I switched to the standard night vision camera covering the same patch of lawn. The screen showed nothing but empty grass and rolling fog. I looked out the physical window into the darkness. Nothing. But the thermal camera showed it was now only 50 feet away. Tink, tink, tink. The tapping returned. This time it wasn't on the front glass. It was on the roof of the gatehouse. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Something was dragging itself across the shingles above my head, moving with a rhythmic, heavy thud. The gatehouse was a solid structure built to withstand a direct impact from a vehicle, yet the roof groaned under the weight of whatever was up there. "I have a weapon. I am authorized to use force," I yelled, my voice cracking with a fear I couldn't hide. The tapping stopped. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then a voice came through the gatehouse intercom, the one that allowed me to speak to visitors at the outer gate, but no one was at the gate. The voice was a perfect, chilling mimic of my own. "I have a weapon," the voice whispered through the speaker. "I am authorized to use force." The sound of my own voice being used against me broke something in my mind. I realized that whatever was outside wasn't just a physical threat, it was something that understood me. It was learning. I looked back at the thermal monitor. The heat signature was gone from the lawn, but the temperature inside the gatehouse began to climb rapidly. My thermometer jumped from 70 degrees to 95 in seconds. The air became thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. Suddenly, the monitors began to flicker and die one by one. Camera 1, black. Camera 4, static. Camera 7, gone. The last feed to remain was the thermal camera inside the ballroom. The heat mass was back in the center of the room, but it had changed. It was no longer a chaotic cloud. It had formed into the shape of a man sitting at a table holding a phone to his ear. My cell phone, sitting on the desk right in front of me, began to vibrate. The caller ID was private number. My hand shook as I reached for it. I didn't want to answer, but I felt a magnetic pull, a compulsion that I couldn't resist. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. The sound on the other end wasn't a voice. It was the sound of the ballroom music, clear and beautiful, playing right into my ear. And under the music, a low, guttural growl that sounded like stones grinding together. I looked up at the gatehouse ceiling just as the reinforced glass of the skylight began to crack. The shadow of the estate was no longer just a figure on a screen. It was coming in, and I was about to find out exactly why those stone walls were built so high. The first crack in the reinforced skylight sounded like a gunshot. I looked up, frozen, as a spiderweb of white fractures bloomed across the glass. The heavy, rhythmic thudding on the roof stopped, replaced by a wet, sliding sound, as if something massive and boneless was maneuvering itself toward the opening. My phone was still pressed to my ear, the distorted ballroom music playing a frantic, mocking waltz that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of my heart. Through the cracks in the glass, a dark, oily substance began to drip, thick, black, and smelling of ancient decay. In a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled survival instinct, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight in my bag, diving under the metal security desk just as the skylight shattered completely. Shards of safety glass rained down like hailstones. I expected a physical weight to land on the floor, but there was only a soft thrumming asterisk sound like the vibration of 1,000 bees. I risked a glance from under the desk and saw it, the shadow. It wasn't a solid creature. It was a shifting, translucent mass of darkness that seemed to pull the very light out of the room. It hovered over the monitors, its long, spindly limbs, the same ones I had seen tapping the glass, stretching out to touch the dead screens. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled from under the desk and bolted for the gatehouse door. I burst out into the night air, but the mist was so thick now that I couldn't see my own feet. The grand mansion in the distance was no longer a house. It was a glowing beacon of unnatural heat, pulsating with a rhythmic red light that matched the waltz still playing in my head. I ran toward the outer perimeter wall, desperate to reach the small service gate I had the key for. As I ran, the ground beneath me felt wrong, soft and yielding, like I was stepping on something living. I turned my flashlight back toward the gatehouse and saw the shadow figure standing in the doorway watching me. It didn't chase me, it didn't have to. The voice returned not through a speaker this time, but directly inside my skull. It was my own voice, distorted and layered. "The walls aren't to keep them out, little canary. The walls are to keep the world from seeing what we've become." I reached the service gate, my hands shaking so violently I dropped the keys twice. I finally jammed the key into the lock and threw the gate open, stumbling out onto the public road. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked half a mile away. I drove until the sun came up, never once looking in the rearview mirror, terrified that I would see a pale, jagged hand reaching from the backseat. 2 days later, I gathered enough courage to call the security agency. I told them I was quitting, effective immediately. The woman on the phone sounded confused. "Blackwood Estate?" she asked, shuffling through papers. "Sir, we haven't had a contract for that property in 3 years. The last guard we sent there, well, he's still missing." I went back to the estate one last time during the bright, clear afternoon of the following week. I stayed in my car on the main road looking through binoculars. The 10-foot stone walls were still there. The gatehouse was still there. But the mansion, the massive Victorian masterpiece, was gone. In its place was nothing but an overgrown field of dead, gray grass and a few charred ruins of a foundation that looked decades old. I checked the property records again that evening. The Blackwood Estate had burned to the ground in 1994, killing everyone inside during a winter gala. There had been no owners for 20 years. There had been no eccentric family. I still have the recordings on my phone, the ones from the gatehouse monitors I managed to cloud sync before they died. When I play them back, they don't show a mansion or a shadow. They show me sitting in a rusted abandoned shack in the middle of a forest, talking to myself and staring at broken empty screens. But then at the very end of the last video, the camera tips over. For a split second, you can see a pale, fish-bellied hand with jagged bone claws reaching for the lens. I've moved to the city now, far away from the quiet valleys and the mist. I work in a brightly lit mall where there are always people around. But sometimes when I'm at home and the room gets too quiet, I hear it. Tink, tink, tink. A soft tapping on my window 10 stories up. I don't look. I just turn up the music and pray for the sun to rise. Because I know now that once the shadow of the estate marks you as its canary, it never truly stops listening to your song.